Hamlet and his problems in this essay. The author gives us a critical reading of Hamlet. The author's main overall points were that Hamlet is most certainly an artistic failure, along with Hamlet the play being the main problem, with Hamlet the character being secondary. The author, Eliot, believes that Hamlet was only successful as it appealed to a particular creative mind critic. He believed that this specific creative mind individual easily projects his own character onto Hamlet. This can cause the critique to become biased, as they feel that they can relate a lot better to Hamlet. He specifically mentions Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Samuel Taylor Coleridge of succumbing to this. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe does this through turning Hamlet into his own Werther, which is a story that he wrote himself, showing his own bias towards liking Hamlet. Samuel Taylor Coleridge did the same thing, but this time turning into more of a talk on Hamlet, making Hamlet a Coleridge. Eliot believed that due to their personal biases towards Hamlet, that rather than looking at the play as a whole, they honed in just the character of Hamlet. Eliot believes that this is the most leading kind of possible way of analyzing such a piece of literature. Eliot believed that due to this, they both possessed unquestionable critical insight and both made their critical aberrations more plausible by the substitution of their own Hamlet for Shakespeare's, which is their creative gifts effects. He didn't like how they didn't take that play for what it was literally and how they add their own creative ideas on it, which to him is the absolute worst way in analyzing a piece of literature. Eliot believes that if the artistic value is not directly in the lines themselves, that the text fails on almost all scales. Eliot favors people like J.M. Robertson, who looks at the play as a whole rather than just the character Hamlet himself. Eliot believes that the play work can only be criticized according to standards of already completed work. The last key part that this article mainly talks about is the only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is finding an objective correlative. An objective correlative is using a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which provoke a specific emotion. This must be done through a sensory experience. The overall general point is that Eliot believes that Hamlet is an artistic failure, along with believing that not viewing the play overall, but rather honing in on just Hamlet himself is one of the worst ways of reviewing and analyzing a play. I personally agree with this view on reviewing literature like this. If we review literature based on creative ideas and opinions and that make us attached to the characters rather than the literal meaning of the text, we aren't really discussing how good Shakespeare is at writing a play. I also side towards Eliot's view as later in the essay he discusses how Shakespeare's play fails at being able to express Hamlet's emotions through his surroundings. This causes the audience to lack the understanding of how Hamlet really feels. The problem is Shakespeare is a bit off more than he could chew, as Shakespeare struggles to show these emotions through the text. Shakespeare can't find an objective correlative for Hamlet, causing the audience to not really be able to understand Hamlet without coming up with their own mental image of him. This to me is an artistic failure, as the audience should not have to come up with their own creative reasoning. It should be expressed through the text. The ending problem becomes that it seems almost as if Shakespeare himself does not seem to be able to understand. So he can also not really express it through Hamlet either, if he can't feel it himself. An example of this is the quote, "Wast Hamlet wronged Laertius, never Hamlet. If Hamlet from himself be ta'en away, and then he's not himself does wrong Laertius, then Hamlet does it not. Hamlet denies it. Who does it then? His madness?" In this line, we can see that Hamlet has gone so mad that he denies he has any responsibility. But we don't really know how Hamlet himself feels right now, as his emotions aren't really clearly explained through events or through an object in a sensory experience where we can understand his perspective and reasoning. In other words, Shakespeare doesn't give us an object correlative to work off, as this quote doesn't really provoke a sensory experience for us to make of it. This is shown once again when Hamlet says, "I am but mad northwest. When the wind is southerly, I know a hawk from a handsaw." Shakespeare once again does really well of showing us that Hamlet has indeed lost his mind and has descended madness. But Shakespeare struggles to show the audience why he has gone mad. Shakespeare fails to show through an object correlative why Hamlet is acting the way he does to the king later in the story, and overall in general fails to show why Hamlet took the actions he did later in the story. The good and the bad. The main weaknesses and flaws of Eliot's essay is that although Eliot begins Hamlet and his problems talking about how we must analyze the full play and its content, Eliot spends a large portion of the essay surprisingly himself talking about Hamlet and his effects and the character's effects on the play, a lot compared to the actual play in itself, like he wanted. Eliot also doesn't really have a real suggestion on how to fix Hamlet and improve it as a play. He just has his own thoughts on it. Although object correlative is a good concept that is a proper way to express emotions through writing and is one of the positives of this text, you could argue we didn't really know what emotion Shakespeare actually wanted for Hamlet to have. So we can't really blame him for not being able to express the emotion in a piece of literacy. I also think that this is a cheap excuse, though, as you should make a character emotion that you can not show or make sense of in a work of art or literature. It doesn't really make sense to put something in that you just can't really relate to. I believe this deeply as there needs to be a logical way that we can see and divide the differences between a good and a bad piece of literature. In summary, Eliot's essay is highly refined and does a really good job of comparing old pieces of literature to Hamlet's and pointing out its objective failure at expressing emotion through its main character, making Shakespeare's Hamlet look like a horrible mess of literature. The downfall of the essay is it's sometimes counterproductive, as the main focus of what Eliot wants to attack is sometimes lost when it seems most of the essay is discussing Hamlet as a character rather than Hamlet as a play like he wanted, which is counterintuitive to what he disliked about how certain critiques such as Goethe were doing. Overall, my thoughts are that Eliot really wanted Shakespeare to do a better job at expressing Hamlet's emotions through the text, and that he believed that Shakespeare just couldn't artistically do it himself.